spring. A time for sunny skies and high expectations for what's to come in the following warmth. As the season changes from cold and silver to warm and golden, so do our expectations. With those expectations follows excitement and hype for what we were promised. Without warning, video games began to flow like a waterfall made of video games. Good lord, that's terrible. How the hell do hard-boiled detectives come up with metaphors? You know what? How do they practically speak in metaphors? Anyway, March arrives. A full schedule. A packed house of titles from Dragon's Dogma 2 to a new South Park game. It's wall-to-wall video games, and baby, I'm out of goddamn money. Just my luck. There's one releasing later in the month that's one of the few that actually catches my attention. Wallet Saved. A title that's about to convince the aging gamers to lean forward out of their Barca loungers. An IP that most will feel is cursed. It lingers in lowly rated obscurity and has for far longer than any of its contemporaries. Trust issues are rampant in this industry. I get why. But like a junkie needing a fix, I needed Alone in the Dark.
Oh, I just love Louisiana!
So, your uncle. What's wrong with him?
He's possessed.
As in the devil?
You know, I was completely on the fence my first few hours playing this game. There was so much that I was quickly falling in love with, but there was also a decent amount of stuff that could very well keep me from feeling that love.
First impressions were certainly everything, as they normally are, and in this case, I was initially spellbound by the setting of 1920s Louisiana and the mystical mansion hiding a dark secret. This type of game is and always will be my favorite. Survival horror, for whatever reason, is most assuredly going to be at the top of my lists in terms of what I get hyped for and what I anticipate the most. The mechanics and function of games in this genre just truly click with me. Naturally, Alone in the Dark was very quickly on my radar as a rather sizable blip. It was set to check every single box for me, from setting and genre to having talent that I'm a big fan of in David Harbour and Jodie Comer. I did have some worries, though. Reviews coming out a day before launch were more mixed than I have seen in a long time. Possibly ever?
Was this another disappointment in a long line of cursed games, or was this the masterpiece that fans of a nearly 30-year-old franchise had been waiting for? Why don't we find out? Alone in the Dark is a survival horror remake of the original 1992 DOS game of the same title that sees you exploring the famed Derceto Manor, a mental institution that seems to have far more than meets the eye going on within its walls.
The original title is credited by many as being the grandfather of the survival horror genre, having pioneered mechanics that would later be popularized by Resident Evil and many more onwards. You'll choose one of two protagonists to play, Detective Edward Carnby or Emily Hartwood. Both have a slightly different experience ahead of them. Carnby is hired by Emily to help her find out what's going on at Derceto after her uncle, a patient there, claims that everyone else at the manor is part of some kind of cult.
I received a disturbing letter from Jeremy accusing the staff and all the other patients of being involved in some cult. And now they are also out to get him.
The pair take a little road trip from New Orleans to the manor located out in the bayou. A setting that I feel is a little underutilized in this genre. I know Resident Evil 7 used the same setting, but that was more wet. Plus, 2017 is very different from 1928. Not the point. The first thing that actually blew me away about this game was the art direction. Every environment you'll be going through feels so well designed and organized. The bedrooms, for instance, despite being kinda massive, holy cow, all really do look like they were lived in. The dark French Quarter streets really brought me to another reality, quite literally, and heightened the sense of unease. I was transported completely from the get-go. Nothing here is massive and sprawling, but that led to significantly greater density in the design. No part of the game's world felt spread too thin. While running around those dark city streets, I was immediately reminded of the dark place in Alan Wake 2. Sure, this game has way less detail than Alan Wake 2, but that's just a place I was reminded of. Every nook and cranny did feel detailed, even though it wasn't even remotely as large or as jam-packed, like I said, as the dark place. I was still able to look around and get lost in the vibes of the area. All of it is in perfect service of the game's narrative, which is actually quite strong, despite maybe getting a bit confusing here and there. But for me, that works anyway, because in my spooky media, I appreciate elements that kind of confuse me or create more questions than they answer. Just know that this is actually a pretty good story altogether. The writer for this game has a fairly awesome resume, having worked on Amnesia, The Dark Descent, and Soma. His writing is enhanced further by the production design and pretty great performances from the entire cast.
Those old French quarters, the voodoo people, the gangsters. I'm sure you live an exciting life.
I know that they have Hollywood talent leading the way with Harbour and Comer, and they did great, but everyone brings it here. Also, as a side note, I know that David is getting the majority of the attention, most likely because of Stranger Things, but I think Comer is really the standout amongst the rest of the cast personally. While both protagonists have unique connections to this mystery and different motivations, Emily as a character stood out a bit more from the get-go, as she's the whole reason that Carnby is even along for the ride. He's here to do his job and get his money, and while we certainly learn a lot more about him as time goes on, I found Emily's story to be a grade more interesting.
Fantastic design, writing, and performances, all wrapped up in the beautiful non-Christmas gift that is the score that introduced me to a completely new genre of music. Doom jazz, or dark jazz if you prefer. The first time I sat at the game's main menu, the music really made me stop. And thinking back on it, it made me all the more immersed and ready for the adventure that was to come. So we pull up to Derceto Manor, ready to get this party started, but how does it go? Well, let's briefly talk about performance to start.
I played Alone in the Dark on my 4090 setup at 1440p maxed out settings and had a generally fine experience. Big surprise coming from a 4090. There were some rough frame stutters for my first couple of hours though. Luckily, Pieces Interactive dropped a day one patch that almost eliminated the stuttering and made the game run about 1,000 times better. I saw a huge increase in stability and frame rate across the board, so kudos to them for getting that out within a few hours of release. My buddy Zach played a bit of the game on his 3070 machine, and I wanted to make mention of his experience really quickly because I personally consider that graphics card to be an order of magnitude closer to the average experience than a 4090 is. He played the game at max settings on 1080p and was able to get 144 FPS, no problemo, consistently. Now, if you've played any survival horror title from the last decade or two, you already have a very accurate picture regarding what it's going to be like to play Alone in the Dark. Third-person and over-the-shoulder exploration and action. You'll be backtracking, solving puzzles, finding keys, and when the situation calls for it, beating monsters to death with bricks and shovels.
The band was jumping, the people too. Mess around. They're doing the mess around.
I am quite sad, though, that you don't get to slap monsters to death like you could in the original game.
Alone in the Dark has a fun and familiar structure where you'll be finding your way into every area of a big-ass house, which kind of acts like an overworld or hub in some sense. At key points, you'll find yourself being transported into an otherworld, which will take many forms. These areas all have a very distinct personality and feel to them. I mentioned the dark New Orleans streets earlier in the video, but my other favorite locale is this graveyard that's lit with candles and is caked with low-hanging fog. It's just so damn pretty. You might actually be surprised by some of the places you're gonna go. Each one of these sections is gonna put you into danger, though, that will require fighting back or running the hell away, and the game makes it plenty clear when it's time for you to do that.
There's too many of them. I gotta get out of here.
When back at Derceto, you can expect more puzzles to solve, most of which are actually pretty damn fun to figure out. Some are incredibly simple, and there's at least one that I found myself feeling pretty good about when I finally figured it out. Reminds me of the piano puzzle in The School in the first Silent Hill game. That will always be my favorite example of a survival horror puzzle. This loop never gets tiring as well, because luckily this game doesn't overstay its welcome. My first full playthrough clocked in at about 7.5 hours, which I've heard some decry as too short, but felt completely fine for me, especially since there is a full second playthrough to be had with your other character. Alone in the Dark is quite fun. I found myself loving it so much that it's the first time I bought a game on launch day and beat it later that same day. I just couldn't seem to put it down. That being said, though, there are a few things we need to discuss. This story isn't all sunshine. There's some gloom and doom that you'll need to know about before you consider trying this title.
All right, where do we start with this one? Why don't we begin with what most people agree is the most divisive part of the game, the combat.
The game's combat is nothing to write home about. It gets the job done, albeit with some pitfalls that may annoy you more than anything else. You have 3 methods of offense: guns, melee weapons, and what the game refers to as opportunities, which are really just objects you pick up and throw in the spur of the moment like a brick or a Molotov. As far as your guns are concerned, there's only 3 for you to find throughout the story, the best feeling being your shotgun. They're all fine, and it's by far the best feeling part regarding the combat. Your melee weapons, however, will break about every 4 seconds, and never really seem like they're hitting the enemy correctly.
My weapon broke.
It genuinely feels like I'm playing Silent Hill Downpour, or any of the other Western Silent Hill titles. This is an improvement over those, yes, but not a massive, insane one. It also would have been quite nice if maybe your melee weapons could last longer than a single enemy's lifespan. They just break way too fast, and on hard mode, sometimes they don't even last long enough to kill a single enemy. Opportunities were something I did find to be quite helpful if I was in a pinch and I needed to deal a final blow. I just wasn't a big fan of not being able to pocket at least one of them for later use. But I guess that's why they're called opportunities after all. Shit. Plus, this game also does not really utilize any form of traditional inventory management like you might be used to in other survival horror titles. So it just feels like more of a moot point for me to complain that I can't put a brick in my back pocket. Oh yeah, you do have a dodge. I have used it to some degree of success, and that surprises the hell out of me. Combat in Alone in the Dark is at best just fine, and at worst, miserable. I found myself getting used to it pretty quick, but still noting the whole way through that it was nothing to write home about. It's not a colossal failure that will ruin the entire game, but it is worth talking about. The other 2 things I wanted to make mention of are progression bugs and pricing structure. First off, you might still encounter some progression bugs that seem to specifically be relating to autosaves. In Chapter 2 of the game, for whatever reason, I suddenly couldn't interact with anything in my environment at all. Couldn't open doors, pull out my weapon, or pick items up. Reloading my autosave proved to be a fruitless endeavor, as this would only fix the problem for about a minute or so before the same issue would pop up. Luckily, I had a manual save from not too far back that fixed everything, so this wasn't the end of the world. Frustrating nonetheless, though. This was also the only time in the game I experienced anything like this, and then had 0 issues the rest of the way. So it might not even really be an issue across the board, or they might have already fixed it. Who knows? Oh yeah, in starting to clean up the rest of the achievements in my subsequent playthroughs, I unfortunately found out that at least one of those achievements is currently bugged. Hopefully they get that fixed as soon as possible.
All right, now finally, let's talk about the pricing structure.
Alone in the Dark is priced at $60 for the base version of the game, and the deluxe version will set you back an extra $20. What's in the deluxe version, you may be wondering? Filters, a digital art book, soundtrack, director's commentary mode, and a classic skin pack. I remember playing Resident Evil 5 as a kid, being able to unlock filters, models, infinite ammo weapon mods, and skins, all from just playing the game in more challenging modes. Part of what makes survival horror my favorite game genre is that the end of the game is not the end. There's so much reason to play through time and time and time again. You want to do challenges, get achievements, and unlock funny skins and concept art. All those collectibles for multiple playthroughs say, I conquered this game. But here, something as simple as filters are hidden behind a paywall, or at least they would appear to be. The classic skins would have been an incredibly cool unlockable for maybe beating the game on hard mode or something. But no, I really do hope that in time the price can come down a bit. I want this game to succeed so badly, but not at the cost of breaking apart every little thing that can make a game like this special in hopes that you can get as much money from the customer as possible. Don't get me wrong, there is replay value here, just not what you may be used to from other titles.
With all that being said, where does that really leave us? Alone in the Dark is a good game. It's a very well-written love letter to all that its original version initially inspired. And despite any of the issues that we talked about here today, I genuinely think that there's something more than worth your time here. I loved my time with this title, and I really think that you will too. That being said though, I'm gonna have to recommend that you wait for this one to go on sale. At least a little bit. That $60 is a pretty big ask. Again, I want to thank all of you for indulging me with this pretty substantial pivot that I'm currently going through. I'm having the time of my life really trying to expand my horizons and finally start to think a little bit more critically about my favorite storytelling medium. Anyway, I need to be getting back to writing this My Little Pony fanfiction. I have got to get it done as soon as possible. I would like to move on to playing Signalis. So for now, I will bid you all adieu, or whatever the Japanese say.
Fluttershy awoke with a stretch and a yawn, much like she always did. Despite the world not having any clue, Maine disorganized as could be. She could practically see the Z's floating away through the ceiling as she sat up in bed. This particular awakening would rank among the most satisfying the world would never know of. No, that doesn't sound quite right yet.